The brass lock felt like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. Cold and gritty with dust, it sat on the attic door like a challenge Elara hadn't asked for. She pressed her thumb against it, and when it finally gave way with a groan, the sound echoed through the empty hallway behind her. It sounded too much like her own loneliness bouncing back, and she shook her head at the thought. That was silly. She didn't have time for silly. It was the last Saturday of June, and the afternoon sun poured through the windows like melted butter, heating every corner of her mother's house. Elara wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and pulled the attic door open. The stairs disappeared up into darkness, and the air that drifted down smelled old, like cedar and time and things forgotten. She'd been putting this off for 3 months now. 3 months since the funeral, since the relatives had gone home, since the casserole dishes had been returned to their owners. 3 months of walking through rooms that still smelled like her mother's lavender soap, of sleeping in a bed that felt too big, of answering questions about when she'd put the house on the market. She didn't have an answer for them. She didn't have an answer for anything anymore. The attic stairs creaked under her feet, each step a small confession. She was 34 years old, a grown woman with a perfectly good apartment in the city, and here she was, creeping up into the dark like a child afraid of monsters. But the monsters here weren't under the bed. They were in the boxes, in the memories, in the quiet. At the top of the stairs, she stopped and let her eyes adjust. The attic ran the length of the whole house, with small round windows at either end letting in dusty columns of light. Boxes were stacked everywhere, some labelled in her mother's careful handwriting, some not. An old dress form stood in the corner wearing a half-finished dress from another decade. A rocking chair sat empty, still rocking slightly as if someone had just gotten up. Elara pulled the chain on the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the attic filled with weak yellow light. She'd start with the cedar chest. It was the biggest thing up here, sitting against the far wall like it was waiting for her. She remembered it from childhood, remembered her mother telling her it held special things, important things, things that mattered. She'd never been allowed to open it. Well, her mother was gone now. There was no one left to say no. The chest opened with a sound like a sigh, and Elara's breath caught in her throat. Inside, folded carefully in layers of yellow tissue paper, lay things she'd never seen before. A christening gown, so small it seemed impossible a baby had ever worn it. A pair of white gloves, the satin slightly discolored with age. A photograph in a silver frame, the image so faded she could barely make out the woman in it. And beneath everything, at the very bottom, an envelope, cream-colored. The paper soft as velvet under her fingers. No return address, but on the front, in ink that had turned brown with age, an address she knew by heart. 27, Maple Street. This house. Addressed to someone named Miss Beatrice Holloway. Elara had lived in this house her whole childhood. Her mother had grown up in this house. Her grandmother too, she thought. But she'd never heard the name Beatrice Holloway. Ever. She pulled the letter from the envelope with hands that had started to tremble, though she couldn't say why. The paper was thin and fragile, and she handled it like it might turn to dust. The ink was faded but readable, each word written in elegant, careful script. Asterisk, my dearest Beatrice, asterisk. Asterisk, I have watched you for a year from across the square. A year of mornings when you walked to the market with your basket, of afternoons when you sat by the window with your sewing, of evenings when you lit your lamp and I knew you were home. Today you wore a blue ribbon in your hair, the color of cornflowers in June, and I knew I could no longer be silent. Asterisk. Asterisk, I am a woman, just as you are. I know what that means. I know the risks these words carry. But my heart is yours if you will have it. It has been yours since the first time I saw you smile. Asterisk. Asterisk, if you do not feel the same, burn this letter and I will never speak of it again. But if somewhere in your heart you have felt what I have felt, meet me Thursday at sunset by the old oak in Miller's Meadow. I will wait. I will always wait. Asterisk. Asterisk yours, if you'll have me. Asterisk. Asterisk Margaret. Asterisk. Elara's hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. 100 years ago, give or take. 100 years ago, a woman named Margaret had written this letter to a woman named Beatrice who lived in this house. A love letter. A secret love letter, written at a time when such things could destroy you. The attic felt smaller suddenly, closer. The dust motes dancing in the light seemed like ghosts. Elara read the letter again, and then again, each word sinking deeper into her chest. She thought about Margaret, watching from across the square. She thought about the courage it must have taken to put those words on paper. She thought about Beatrice, opening this letter, reading these words, feeling whatever she felt. Had she gone to Miller's Meadow? Had she burned the letter? Had she loved Margaret back? The questions piled up like the boxes around her, and Elara realized she needed to know. She needed to know what happened to them, to these two women who had loved each other in secret 100 years ago. It made no sense, this sudden, desperate curiosity. It was none of her business. They were strangers, dead for decades, their story buried with them. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like Margaret was standing right here, right now, holding her breath and waiting for an answer that would never come. A floorboard creaked downstairs. Elara froze. The sound was sharp and definite, not the settling of an old house but the weight of a footstep. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She was alone. She'd been alone all afternoon. The realtor had the only other key, and she wasn't due until Monday. Another creak, closer this time, coming from the hallway below the attic stairs. Elara's mouth went dry. She looked around wildly for something, anything, to defend herself with. The old dress form. The rocking chair. Nothing useful. The letter was still clutched in her hand, and she pressed it against her chest like it could protect her. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice, low and uncertain, called up the stairs. "Hello. Is someone up there?" A man's voice. Not threatening exactly, but startled. Like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. Elara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her voice had disappeared entirely. More footsteps, slow and careful, on the attic stairs now. The light from below shifted as someone climbed. Elara backed against the wall, the cedar chest between her and the stairs, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. A head appeared through the opening in the floor. A man's head, with dark hair going grey at the temples and eyes that widened when he saw her. "Oh," he said. "I'm sorry. I didn't think anyone was here." He climbed the last few steps and stood at the top of the stairs, and now Elara could see all of him. Tall, thin, wearing a faded plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He held a stack of gardening books in his arms, the ones from the shelf in the living room. His hands, gripping the books, had gone white at the knuckles. He was staring at her. No, not at her. At the letter in her hand. Elara looked down at it, then back at him. The cream-coloured paper. The faded ink. The address on the front. And she understood, without knowing how, that this was not a coincidence. That this man knew something. That the letter in her hand and the man on her stairs were connected in a way she couldn't yet see. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the summer heat. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started up. A bird sang. Normal sounds from a normal world that felt very far away. Then the man spoke again, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in a while. "My name is Leo," he said. "I think we need to talk." The man's name was Leo, and he stood at the top of her attic stairs like he'd been caught breaking a law he didn't know existed. The gardening books in his arms seemed suddenly ridiculous, a poor excuse for being in someone else's house uninvited. Elara watched his knuckles go from white to bloodless, and she realized he was just as scared as she was. Maybe more. She should have been angry. She should have demanded to know what he was doing here, how he'd gotten in, why he thought it was okay to walk into her mother's house like he belonged here. But the words wouldn't come. The letter was still pressed against her chest, and all she could think about was the way his eyes had locked onto it the moment he reached the top of the stairs. "I have a key," he said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. He shifted the books to one arm and reached into his pocket, pulling out an old brass key on a piece of frayed string. "Your mother gave it to me. Years ago. I used to help her with the garden on weekends. She said I could come by anytime, even when she wasn't home." Elara remembered now. Her mother had mentioned someone from the end of the lane, a quiet man who knew about plants and didn't mind getting his hands dirty. She'd pictured someone older, someone retired, someone who fit the image of a small-town gardener. Not this man in his 40s with tired eyes and a voice that sounded like it didn't get enough practice. She passed, Elara said. It came out flat, like she was reading from a script. 3 months ago. I know. Leo looked down at the books in his arms. I came to the funeral. Sat in the back. I don't know if you saw me. She hadn't. She hadn't seen anything that day except the coffin and the flowers and the ground opening up to take her mother away. I'm sorry, he continued. I should have called first. I didn't think anyone would be here. The house has been empty so long, and the peonies needed dividing. Your mother always wanted them divided before the summer heat set in. I thought I'd do it for her. One last time. The peonies. Elara had forgotten about them entirely. They grew along the side of the house, huge bushes her mother had tended for 30 years. Deep pink ones that smelled like heaven in early June. They'd finished blooming weeks ago, and Elara hadn't even noticed. She looked at Leo again, really looked this time. At the dirt under his fingernails. At the sunburn on his forearms. At the way he held those gardening books like they were precious, like they mattered. This was a man who loved plants, who loved her mother's garden, who had come here on a Saturday afternoon to do a kindness for someone who could no longer ask for it. I found something, Elara heard herself say. Her voice sounded strange, distant. She held up the letter. In the cedar chest. It's old. Really old. Addressed to someone named Beatrice Holloway. Did you know that name? Did my mother ever mention it? Leo's face changed. The color drained from it slowly, like water running out of a sink. He set the gardening books down on the attic floor, carefully, precisely, and took a step closer. His eyes never left the letter. Beatrice Holloway, he repeated. The name sounded different in his mouth. Heavier. Like it meant something. She lived here, Elara said. A long time ago. Before my family. Before anyone I know. The letter is from someone named Margaret. She wrote it over 100 years ago, I think. Maybe more. I know. The words hung in the dusty attic air. Elara stared at him. What do you mean, you know? Leo ran a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. He looked suddenly exhausted, like the weight of something old and heavy had just settled onto his shoulders. Beatrice Holloway was my great-aunt, he said. My grandmother's sister. I've been looking for traces of her for years. Photographs, letters, anything. She died young, before I was born, and no one in my family ever talked about her. It was like she'd been erased. Elara's heart was beating too fast again. She could feel it in her throat, in her temples, in the tips of her fingers where they held the letter. The paper was warm now from her skin, warm like it was alive, like Margaret's words were still breathing. Why? She asked. Why would they erase her? Leo didn't answer right away. He walked to one of the round windows and looked out at the backyard, at the peonies he'd come to divide, at the oak tree that had probably been there when Beatrice was alive. When Margaret watched her from across the square. Can I see it? He asked finally. The letter. Can I read it? Elara should have said no. It was hers now, found in her house, addressed to a woman who'd lived and loved and died here. But something in his voice, something raw and honest, made her hold it out to him instead. He took it carefully, reverently, like it was made of glass. His eyes moved across the words, and Elara watched his face as he read. Watched his lips press together. Watched his throat move when he swallowed. Watched a single bead of sweat trace a path down his temple, even though the attic wasn't that hot anymore. When he finished, he stood perfectly still for a long moment. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet, worn brown leather with the corners rubbed soft. From inside, he took a photograph and held it out to Elara. It was small, the size you'd carry in a locket or keep in a pocket close to your heart. Black and white, faded to sepia around the edges. A young woman stood in front of a house Elara recognized instantly. Her house. This house. The same porch, the same windows, the same front door. The woman had sad eyes and wore a high-collared dress with a brooch at her throat. Elara turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting that matched the letter perfectly, someone had written, *Beatrice, on the day I first saw her. My heart has never been my own since ***, and underneath, a signature, *Margaret. The attic swam around her. She gripped the windowsill to steady herself, the rough wood biting into her palms. 100 years ago, a woman named Margaret had stood somewhere in this town and taken a photograph of the woman she loved. 100 years ago, she'd written those words. And now, 100 years later, two strangers stood in the same house holding the proof. She loved her, Elara whispered. She really loved her. Leo nodded. His eyes were bright, though whether from dust or emotion she couldn't tell. They must have hidden it, he said. All of it. The letters, the photographs, the truth. In my family, in yours too probably. They hid it so well that we forgot. That everyone forgot. Elara thought about her mother, growing up in this house, sleeping in rooms where Beatrice had slept, walking hallways where Beatrice had walked. Had she known? Had she found these letters herself, read these same words, wondered about these same women? Is that why she'd kept the cedar chest locked all those years? She was waiting, Elara said slowly, the realization dawning as she spoke. My mother. She was waiting for someone to find this. For someone to care. Outside, the afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the backyard. The peonies needed dividing. The house needed sorting. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the letter in Leo's hand and the photograph in hers and the story that had been waiting 100 years to be told. Leo looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen in anyone since her mother died. Understanding. Connection. The recognition of a soul who knew what it was like to carry something heavy. We should look together, he said quietly. Your mother's things, my family stories. See if there's more. See if we can find out what happened to them. Elara should have said no. Should have thanked him for coming, taken back the letter, and returned to the lonely work of packing up a life. But the photograph was warm in her hand, and Margaret's words were warm in her heart, and for the first time in 3 months, she didn't feel quite so alone. Okay, she said. Together. And somewhere, across 100 years of silence, two women who had loved in secret seemed to breathe a little easier. The Historical Society sat on Main Street in a building that had once been the town library. Now it housed records and documents and the collected memories of people who had lived and died and been mostly forgotten. Elara pushed open the heavy front door on the first Friday of July, and the smell hit her immediately. Old glue. Paper decay. Dust that had been settling for decades. It smelled like the attic, like the cedar chest, like the letter she'd read so many times now she had it memorized. Leo was already there, waiting at the front desk. He'd called ahead and spoken to a woman named Patricia who ran the archives. Patricia was in her 70s, with bright eyes behind thick glasses and hands that trembled slightly as she pulled boxes from shelves. She seemed delighted to have visitors, especially visitors interested in the really old records. Beatrice Holloway, Patricia said, leading them to a table in the back room. That name rings a bell. Give me a few minutes. The room was small and windowless, lit by fluorescent lights that hummed softly. Elara sat across from Leo at a wooden table scarred by decades of researchers. She could hear her own heartbeat in the silence, or maybe that was just the hum of the lights. It was hard to tell. A week had passed since the attic. A week of going through her mother's things with new eyes, looking for anything that might connect to Beatrice or Margaret. She'd found nothing. A week of Leo coming by in the evenings, sitting on her porch, sharing what little he'd learned from his own family. Which was almost nothing. His grandmother had refused to talk about her sister. Had changed the subject every time. Had left behind no photographs, no letters, nothing. It was like Beatrice had been erased. Like she'd never existed at all. Patricia returned with a cardboard box labeled Holloway, Beatrice, Property Records 1880 to 1905. She set it down carefully and smiled. This is all we have under that name. Property records, tax assessments, things like that. No personal papers, I'm afraid. Those would have stayed with the family. The family that had erased her. Elara opened the box and pulled out the first folder. It was thin, containing only a few pages. The handwriting was elegant but faded, and she had to squint to read it. 1882. Beatrice Holloway had purchased the house at 27 Maple Street for the sum of $800. She'd been 23 years old. Look at this, Elara said, sliding the document across the table to Leo. She bought it herself. A single woman buying a house in 1882. That must have been unusual. Leo nodded, reading carefully. My family never had money. She must have saved for years. Worked for every penny. They worked through the box methodically, finding nothing personal, nothing that spoke to who Beatrice had been or who she'd loved. Tax records. A receipt for a new roof in 1887. A notice of property tax paid in 1890. Facts and numbers and nothing with a heartbeat. Then Patricia appeared again, this time with a smaller box. Found this in the school records. There's a Margaret Cross listed as a teacher at the Girls' Academy from 1885 to 1901. Thought you might want to see. Elara's hand shook as she opened the box. Inside were attendance ledgers, teacher contracts, and a single photograph. A class photograph from 1895, 20 girls in white dresses standing in rows, and in the back, a woman with dark hair pulled back severely. Margaret. She knew it without being told. The same eyes as the woman who'd written the letter. The same sad mouth. Leo leaned close, his shoulder almost touching hers. She's beautiful, he said quietly. In a quiet way. Like she's keeping secrets. They found her contract next. Margaret Cross agreed to teach English literature and composition for the sum of $40 per month, plus room and board at the school. She signed her name with a flourish, the same handwriting as the letter, the same elegant curves. The sun had set outside without them noticing. The fluorescent lights hummed on, indifferent to the passage of time. Elara's eyes burned from reading, but she couldn't stop. Couldn't look away from these fragments of a life, these crumbs left behind by a woman who'd loved so bravely and been so completely forgotten. Then Leo found it. A newspaper clipping, tucked inside the 1901 attendance ledger. The paper was brittle and brown, cracking at the folds. The date was October 15th, 1901. The headline read, Fire at Girls' Academy claims no lives, but teacher injured in rescue. Elara read over his shoulder, their heads close together in the fluorescent light. Asterisk the fire broke out shortly after midnight in the east wing of the Maplewood Girls' Academy. All 23 students were evacuated safely, thanks in large part to the quick actions of the staff. Miss Margaret Cross, a teacher at the academy for 16 years, was treated for minor burns after being led from the burning building by Miss Beatrice Holloway, a seamstress who lived nearby. Miss Holloway entered the building twice to search for students and refused treatment for her own injuries until all girls were accounted for. They were together, Elara breathed. That night, Beatrice came for her. She went into a burning building to save her. Leo's finger traced the words gently, like he could feel the heat through the paper. It says she was treated for minor burns. Margaret, I mean. And Beatrice refused treatment until the girls were safe. Elara tried to imagine it. The fire in the dark. The screams and the smoke. Beatrice running toward the flames instead of away from them. Margaret, disoriented and afraid, feeling hands grab her and pull her to safety. The moment they must have shared afterward, in the chaos, when they found each other alive. The clipping ended there. No mention of what happened next. No hint of whether their love survived, whether they found a way to be together, whether they grew old holding hands in secret. Patricia appeared again, this time to tell them the building was closing in 15 minutes. Elara nodded without really hearing. She was still in 1901, still standing in the smoke, still watching Beatrice pull Margaret from the fire. They gathered their things and walked out into the night. The street was quiet, the shops dark, the only light coming from the street lamps may go 20 feet. Elara's legs felt weak, like she'd been walking for miles instead of sitting in a chair for hours. "We need to check the census records," Leo said as they reached their cars. 1900, 1910. See if they're still here. See if anything changed. Elara nodded. She was too tired to speak, too full of everything she'd learned to form words. She drove home through streets she'd known her whole life, seeing them differently now. Margaret had walked these streets, had watched Beatrice from across the square, had written a letter that changed everything and nothing. At home, she made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the letter beside her, the photograph propped against the sugar bowl. Beatrice with her sad eyes. Margaret who'd loved her from across the square. Two women who'd existed in this town, in this house, 100 years ago. Her phone buzzed. "Leo." "I found something," he said, his voice tight. "The 1910 census. I accessed it online. Beatrice Holloway isn't listed anywhere. She disappears after 1901. Elara's blood went cold. "What do you mean, disappears?" "I mean she's gone. No record of her in this town, this county, this state. It's like she fell off the earth." "But Margaret." He paused, and she heard him take a breath. "Margaret is listed in the 1910 census, living at 27 Maple Street, alone." The tea cooled untouched on the table. The photograph watched her from beside the sugar bowl. And Elara realized, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that the story she'd been telling herself was wrong. She'd assumed a happy ending. Or at least a peaceful one. Two women loving each other in secret, growing old together, dying in each other's arms. That's what she'd wanted to find. That's what she'd been looking for. But Margaret lived alone in 1910. In Beatrice's house. Without Beatrice. What happened to her? Elara whispered into the phone. Leo was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. But there's one more place we haven't looked. The cemetery. If Beatrice died between 1901 and 1910, there should be a grave." Elara hung up and sat in the dark kitchen, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Her mother had wound that clock every Sunday for as long as Elara could remember. Had stood right here, in this spot, her hands on the glass face, setting the time. Had she known? Had she stood here wondering about the woman who'd lived in this house alone, the woman who'd loved and lost and stayed anyway? Elara looked at the letter again. Margaret's words, so full of hope. Asterisk, "I will wait. I will always wait." Asterisk. And then Elara realized the quiet grief she'd seen in her mother's eyes her entire life was a lie. It wasn't grief for something lost. It was grief for something never found. Her mother hadn't just been sad. She'd been the last person to know this story, to feel its weight, to carry the silence of two women who'd loved each other into the ground with them. She'd kept the cedar chest locked, kept the secret safe, kept the vigil alone. The silence in this house wasn't loneliness at all. It was a shrine, a memorial, a promise kept by generations of women who never spoke the truth but never threw it away either. Elara pressed her palm against the kitchen table and felt the wood solid beneath her hand. The same table where Beatrice had eaten breakfast, where Margaret had sat alone for 9 years, where her mother had wound the clock and wondered and waited for someone to care. Outside, the night wrapped around the house like a blanket. Somewhere in the dark, in the cemetery at the edge of town, two women lay in graves that might or might not be marked, might or might not be together. And Elara understood at last that she wasn't just cleaning out a house. She was finishing a vigil. She was the answer to 100 years of waiting. The cemetery sat on a hill at the edge of town, surrounded by old oak trees that had been there since before anyone could remember. Elara parked her car on the gravel road and walked through the iron gates on a Tuesday morning in mid-August. The grass was dry and brown from weeks of sun, and the air smelled of dust and wildflowers and something else. Something old. Something patient. Leo was already there, standing by the section map bolted to a post near the entrance. He'd been coming here for 3 days now, walking row by row, reading every headstone from the late 1800s and early 1900s. His face was tired, his eyes squinting against the bright sun, but there was something else in his expression too. Determination. The kind that comes from knowing you're close to something important. Anything. Elara asked, though she could see the answer in the way he stood. He shook his head. Holloway, I've found. Plenty of Holloways. But no Beatrice. And no Margaret Cross either. It's like they were never buried here at all. Elara looked out across the rows of headstones, white and grey in the morning light. Hundreds of them. Thousands, maybe. Names and dates and sometimes a few words carved in stone. Lives reduced to a single marker, visited by no one, remembered by no one. Except these two. These two would be remembered. She was going to make sure of it. We are looking at this wrong, she said slowly. The thought had been forming in her mind for days, ever since the night she'd realized her mother's silence was a vigil. We've been trying to find them in the official records. The census, the property documents, the cemetery maps. But they spent their whole lives hiding. Why would their graves be any different? Leo turned to look at her, a crease forming between his eyebrows. What do you mean? I mean, maybe we need to think like them. Like people who had to keep secrets to survive. Where would you hide a grave if you couldn't mark it properly? If you couldn't put their real names on the stone? The question hung in the warm morning air. Around them, the cemetery was quiet except for the caw of a distant crow and the rustle of wind through the oaks. Leo's face changed slowly as the idea took hold. The family plots, he said. They could have been buried in family plots with no individual markers. Or with markers that don't say their names. Just dates maybe. Or initials. They split up, walking different sections, reading every stone with new eyes. Elara looked for anything unusual. Anything that didn't quite fit. A stone that seemed newer than the ones around it. A space between graves that seemed too large. A marker with only a first name, or only initials, or nothing at all. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun climbed higher and the temperature rose until Elara's shirt was sticking to her back and her head was starting to ache. She'd found nothing. Not a trace. Not a hint. She was about to give up, to suggest they take a break and come back later, when she saw it. A headstone at the edge of the Holloway family plot, set slightly apart from the others, half hidden by an overgrown bush. She pushed the branches aside and knelt in the dry grass to read it. The stone was simple grey granite, smaller than the others, with no name at all. Just 2 dates carved beneath a single word. Asterisk beloved asterisk. Asterisk 1860. 1904 asterisk. Elara's heart stopped. Then started again, faster than before. 1860 to 1904. That would make her 44 when she died. And the word. Not beloved daughter or beloved sister or beloved wife. Just beloved. Like the person buried here was loved, purely and simply, but the person doing the loving couldn't say it out loud. Leo, she called, her voice cracking. Over here. He came running, and when he saw what she'd found, he dropped to his knees beside her. His hand reached out and touched the stone gently, tracing the letters. 1904, he said quietly. 3 years after the fire. She died in 1904, and they couldn't put her name. They couldn't say who she was. But they buried her here, with her family, and they marked her as beloved. That's all they could do. Elara thought about Margaret, living alone in Beatrice's house for 3 years after losing her. 3 years of waking up in a bed that still smelled like her. 3 years of walking past the chair where she used to sit. 3 years of loving someone she couldn't publicly mourn. And then she thought about the grave they hadn't found yet. Margaret's grave. If Beatrice was here, in the Holloway plot, then where was Margaret? She stood up suddenly, her legs stiff from kneeling. Margaret's not here. She wouldn't be. The Holloways wouldn't bury her with the family. Not in 1904. Not when it would raise questions. Leo stood too, brushing dirt from his knees. Then where? She lived in a house on Maple Street for years after Beatrice died. She would have gone to church somewhere. Had friends, maybe. There must be a record. But Elara was already walking, following a path that led away from the Holloway plot, deeper into the older section of the cemetery. She didn't know where she was going. She was just following a feeling, a pull, something that felt almost like instinct. The stones here were older, worn smooth by 100 winters, the writing on some of them nearly illegible. She passed names and dates without really seeing them, her eyes scanning for something she couldn't name. And then she found it. At the very back of the cemetery, against a stone wall covered in ivy, was a single headstone. Smaller than the others. Plain. Unassuming. The kind of grave that people walked past without noticing. But Elara noticed. Because the name carved into the stone was Margaret Cross. Born 1858. Died 1918. And below the dates, a single line. Asterisk she waited. Asterisk. Elara's knees gave out. She sank to the ground in front of the stone, her hand reaching out to touch the cool grey granite. 14 years. Margaret had lived 14 years after Beatrice died. 14 years in that house, alone, waiting for something that would never come. Leo knelt beside her, and together they read the words again. Asterisk she waited. Asterisk. That's it, Elara whispered. That's the whole story. That's everything. But Leo was frowning, leaning closer to the stone. Look, he said, pointing to the bottom edge. There's something else. Engraved smaller. Almost hidden. Elara leaned in, brushing away the moss that had grown over the bottom of the stone. And there, in letters so small they were almost invisible, were 4 more words. Asterisk together now. My love. Asterisk. The tears came before Elara could stop them. Hot and sudden, running down her cheeks and dripping onto the grass. Together now. After 14 years of waiting, after a lifetime of loving in secret, after 100 years of silence, Margaret had found a way to say it. To claim it. To make sure someone, someday, would know. She arranged this, Elara said, her voice breaking. Before she died. She arranged to have that added. She knew no one would notice for years, maybe decades. But she did it anyway. She made sure the truth was here, waiting for someone to find it. Leo put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, not caring that they'd only known each other a few weeks, not caring about anything except the 2 women who had loved each other so much that even death couldn't silence them. They stayed there a long time, sitting on the grass in front of Margaret's grave, and then they walked back to Beatrice's stone and sat there too. 2 graves, 100 yards apart, connected by a love that refused to be forgotten. Elara pulled out her phone and took photographs of both stones. Of the words. Of the evidence that Margaret and Beatrice had existed, had loved, had waited. We need to tell someone, she said. The Historical Society. The local newspaper. People need to know they were here. That they mattered. Leo nodded slowly. My family needs to know. Your family too. The ones who kept the secret for so long. They deserve to know it's finally over. On the way back to the car, Elara stopped and looked back at the cemetery one last time. The sun was starting its slow descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the graves. Somewhere behind her, 2 women lay in the ground, finally together, finally known. And in her pocket, the letter from Margaret to Beatrice seemed to warm against her heart, as if it knew its long journey was almost complete. As if it knew that after 100 years, love had finally found its way home. The first Saturday of September arrived with a cool breeze that carried the smell of turning leaves and the last of the summer flowers. Elara stood in her backyard, her hands deep in the soil, pulling weeds that had grown wild while she'd been lost in another century. The peonies her mother had loved were done for the year, their leaves already starting to yellow, but she could see where new shoots would come in spring. That was the thing about gardens. They kept going. They trusted the seasons. They believed in tomorrow. Leo appeared around the side of the house carrying 2 cups of coffee from a shop on Main Street. He'd been coming by almost every day since the cemetery, since they'd sat on the grass between two graves and let 100 years of silence wash over them. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. It didn't seem to matter either way. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing her a cup. The ceramic was warm through her dirty hands, and she breathed in the smell before taking a sip. Coffee and soil and the last of the summer roses. It smelled like hope. Like starting over. They'd done everything they could think of to tell Margaret and Beatrice's story. An article in the local newspaper. A presentation at the Historical Society, with Patricia beaming from the front row. A small ceremony at the cemetery where a handful of people had gathered to lay flowers on two graves that had waited so long to be noticed. Leo's cousin had come, the one who'd inherited his grandmother's photo albums, and she'd cried when she saw the photograph of Beatrice standing in front of the house. She was real, she kept saying. She was really real. As if any of them had ever doubted it. Elara took another sip of coffee and looked at her garden. At the peonies. At the rose bushes her mother had planted when Elara was born. At the bare patch of earth where she'd spent the morning digging. "I found something," she said. "Yesterday. In the attic." Leo raised his eyebrows but didn't speak. He'd learned to wait when Elara was finding her words. She set down her coffee and walked to the back porch, where a small leather-bound book sat on the steps. It was old, the cover cracked and faded, the pages edged with gold that had mostly worn away. She'd found it in the attic floorboards, hidden beneath a loose board she'd stepped on 100 times without noticing. The same board that had creaked the day she'd found the letter, the day this whole journey began. It was Margaret's, Elara said, handing it to Leo. "Her diary. The last one, I think. It starts in 1905 and ends in 1918, just before she died." Leo took it carefully, reverently, the same way he'd taken the letter that first day in the attic. He opened to a page near the middle, and Elara watched his eyes move across the faded ink. "She wrote about Beatrice," he said quietly. "All of it. The years after. The waiting." Elara nodded. She'd stayed up most of the night reading, unable to stop, unable to look away from the words of a woman who had loved and loved anyway. Margaret's handwriting had grown shakier over the years, but her voice remained clear. Steady. Full of a quiet determination that took Elara's breath away. The entry from 1906, a year after Beatrice's death, had made her cry. "I visited her today. The stone is plain, as we agreed. No name, no sign, nothing that might cause questions. But I know she's there. I feel her when I stand on that spot, the grass warm beneath my feet. I told her about the garden, about the roses that bloomed this year, about the cat that has taken up residence on the back porch. I told her I love her. I will always tell her, even if no one hears but the wind. Leo turned pages slowly, reading here and there, his face soft with something that looked like wonder. "She kept going," he said. "She built a life. Taught school until she retired. Tended the garden. Made friends with the neighbors. She did all of it while carrying this love, this grief, this secret." "The last entry," Elara said. "Read the last one." Leo found it, dated March 1918. Margaret would have been 60 years old, with only months left to live. "I have made arrangements. The stone will say what I want it to say, though the words will be small, hidden, easy to miss. But someone will find them someday. Someone will read them and know. That's all I can hope for. That's enough. I have loved her for 40 years. 40 years of watching from across the square, of secret meetings and quiet joys, of grief and waiting and finally, the certainty that we will be together again. I don't know when or how. I only know it's true. She was my heart from the moment I saw her. She will be my heart until the end of time. I am not afraid. Leo closed the book gently and sat on the porch steps, his hands resting on the worn leather. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the grass, and the air was cool enough to raise goosebumps on Elara's arms. "She knew," he said. She knew someone would find it eventually. She trusted that. Elara sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. My mother knew too. Not the details maybe, but enough. She kept the cedar chest locked. She never threw anything away. She was waiting for someone to care enough to look. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light change, listening to the birds and the distant sound of a lawnmower and all the ordinary noises of a Saturday afternoon in a small town. Ordinary, but not ordinary. Nothing felt ordinary anymore. I've been thinking, Elara said finally, about the house, about what to do with it. Leo turned to look at her, and she could see the question in his eyes. The house on Maple Street had been in her family for over 100 years. Selling it would feel like the end of something. But staying felt impossible too. She had a life in the city, a job, an apartment full of her things. What did you decide? He asked. Elara took a breath. I'm not selling. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I talked to a contractor last week. There's some work that needs doing, things I've been ignoring for years. But the bones are good. The bones are solid. Leo's face did something complicated. Hope and surprise and something else she couldn't quite name. I'm going to split my time, she continued. Weekends here, some holidays, maybe summers if I can work it out. It's not perfect, but it's something. It's a start. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass lock from the attic chest. She'd cleaned it, oiled it, polished it until it gleamed. Now it sat in her palm, warm from her skin, transformed from a symbol of secrets kept to something else entirely. I'm going to put this on the front door, she said. Not to lock people out. To welcome them in. To say that this house has nothing to hide anymore. Leo smiled, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger, lighter. She'd like that. Margaret, I mean. She'd like that someone finally opened the door. Elara stood and walked to the flower bed she'd been working on, the one where she'd spent the morning digging and weeding and preparing for spring. From a paper bag on the ground, she pulled out a small cluster of bulbs, their papery skins dry and brown. What are those? Leo asked, coming to stand beside her. Crocuses, she said. The early ones that bloom in February or March, sometimes even through snow. I ordered them last week. 100 of them. She knelt in the dirt and began planting, pushing each bulb gently into the soil, covering it, moving to the next spot. Leo knelt beside her and started helping, his hands clumsy but willing. For Beatrice, Elara said as she worked. And Margaret. And my mother. For all of them. They planted together as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange and gold. When they finished, the flower bed was transformed, 100 small promises waiting beneath the soil for spring to call them up. Elara sat back on her heels and looked at what they'd done. The house behind her, warm in the evening light. The garden her mother had tended for 30 years. The bulbs that would bloom in February, the earliest flowers of the year, the ones that came before everything else. She wrote about crocuses, Elara said softly. Margaret, in her diary. She said Beatrice loved them because they came so early, because they didn't wait for perfect conditions, because they pushed through snow and cold and dark to find the sun. Leo nodded slowly. That sounds like her. That sounds like both of them. They cleaned up their tools and walked to the front of the house, where Elara had already drilled holes in the heavy wooden door. She fitted the brass lock into place, felt it click, stepped back to look. It was the same lock that had guarded the attic for 100 years. The same lock that had kept secrets safe. But now it sat at eye level, polished and gleaming, a reminder that some things are worth waiting for. Leo reached out and touched it gently. What happens now? He asked. Elara looked at the house, at the garden, at the man beside her. She thought about Margaret and Beatrice, about her mother, about all the women who had lived and loved and waited in this place. She thought about the letter in her nightstand drawer, the diary on her porch, the photographs on her phone. She thought about spring, about crocuses, about 100 small bulbs trusting the dark. Now we wait, she said. And while we wait, we live. That's what they'd want. That's what anyone would want. Leo smiled again, and this time she smiled back. The evening wrapped around them like a blanket, soft and warm and full of possibility. In February, the crocuses would bloom, blue and purple and yellow, pushing through whatever remained of winter to find the sun. And Elara would be here to see them. Leo too, maybe. And somewhere, across 100 years of silence, two women who had loved in secret would finally rest easy, knowing their story had been found, their love remembered, their waiting finally over. The brass lock gleamed on the door. The house stood quiet and patient. And in the garden, 100 small bulbs dreamed of spring.